Hello, I'm George Mason, host of Good God, Conversations that Matter about Faith and Public Life. How does the church speak to social issues in a way that doesn't lose its own soul in doing so? We'll be exploring that with Father Joshua Whitfield. Welcome to Good God. I'm joined today by Father Joshua Whitfield, who is pastoral administrator of the St. Rita's Catholic Church here in Dallas. He is a Catholic priest and a social commentator as well. He writes for the Dallas Morning News frequently as a columnist. And today we want to discuss something of the tradition of the church speaking to public life. Now, some of that is part of the Protestant tradition also, as well as the Catholic tradition. But Josh, it seems to me that we are in a day when people who are in the pew are deeply challenged by priests and preachers, pastors, who are commenting upon public life. One of the things we hear all the time, and I hear it all the time, is preaching is too political today. Let's just talk about the gospel. When you write and when you talk about public life, do you hear similar comments from your people?
Oh yes, I hear the same things you hear, and the challenge is, or the accusation is, what you say is. You're going beyond the pale of your responsibility.
Yes.
You're
getting out of your lane.
You're getting out of your lane by
Yes.
commenting upon issues and matters in the nation or in the city, in the polis, and that's not what we've come here for. They say that we've come here to hear about Jesus, to hear about salvation, to hear about prayer and faith, and so on and so forth. So I get that all the time, and I think it's because we live in a world in which absolutely everything is politicized, right? And so, it's a critique that is emotive, that's certainly not rooted in the gospel tradition or in the scriptures in the scriptures themselves, I should say. Because if you spend 5 minutes reading the Gospel of Mark or or the Gospel of Luke, especially. You will be disabused of that. Just give me
Sure.
Jesus.
So it's difficult to know exactly where this comes from, but I think it's clearly been true throughout the whole history of the church, right? That this notion of the gospel is not just an otherworldly sort of thing, but rooted in the idea that Jesus actually is the presence of God in human experience among us and continues to be present, challenging all powers and calling us to embrace a different way of life. It does seem that so much of what's happening in American Christianity, at least right now, is this idea that our life in the world should be the free of challenge, except when it comes to certain moral positions like sexuality or marriage or some such thing, but abortion being another. These are sort of agreed upon, okay, we can talk about those political issues in worldly terms, but otherwise let's leave economics to the marketplace, let's leave our social, racial politics to work out in our neighborhoods and in our communities, and let's let Jesus only stand for the afterlife.
Sure. Yeah, those are important issues, and they're worth talking about and fighting about. But they are elements within a broader view of what Jesus called the kingdom. Part of the criticism that you and I receive, I should think, comes from the plain fact that people don't want to hear the gospel where it pinches them, And so, I'm the same way. I like it when Jesus says nice things to me, rather than challenges me. But if you look at the Gospels, if you look at the New Testament, it's not complicated. Jesus called together a community of disciples, which he called the kingdom, right? And this community loved in a radical way. They forgave in a radical way. They served in a radical way. It was a distinct community which we call the kingdom, which we call the church. And this is the new creation, right? Yes. And it began with Christ and the 12 and the 70 and so on and so forth. And it continues, and it has its own unique ethics, its own virtue, its own telos, its own end, which is the kingdom of heaven, and that is the revolution, right? That is the way of living, the way of loving, which was meant to go out into the world and change it, not to baptize or approve or endorse or support political regimes across the spectrum, right?
But if there is a legitimate critique that I struggle to accept and yet have to concede, I think it is also true that sometimes the church gives over its language and its sense of mission to a kind of human rights language, to a kind of political idealism, whether of the left or the right, and sees itself somehow in service to a vision of the world that is more politically oriented than rooted in our own vision of community and the church.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think we are vulnerable to that criticism, both left and right. And so you've talked about recently in a column that you wrote for the Dallas Morning News how this has been true in the question of what we do with refugees, about our immigration policy and the like. And you've said that the key thing is for us to think like Christians about this, to talk like Christians, not primarily to talk like Americans, but to talk like Christians. Say more about that.
Well, again, if you take the basic idea that there is the church, right? There is the kingdom which Jesus created and founded, and it's meant to love in this radical Jesus way. And if you take that concept, you take those ethics to American 2018, and you discover that there are people coming to your border who are escaping violence in Honduras. What is a Christian supposed to do? A Christian is supposed to act like Jesus. A Christian is supposed to do what Jesus said you would do in that situation. Jesus, at no point, Paul at no point, notwithstanding misreadings of Romans 13, which is a huge problem, Jesus would have said, look, here's a widow and orphan, right? Your moral obligation to widow and orphan transcends the good of national sovereignty, the good of protecting your borders. The moral obligation is clear. You help those people, right? How do we do that? Well, not what we've been doing, right? And so that's where the ethics of Jesus, for the followers of Jesus, do transcend any sort of nationalist rhetoric. It does transcend the sort of, quite frankly, fear-mongering that is coming from the highest places in the land.
I had this thought as I was preparing for our lectionary text this week, which I'm not sure if we're in the same lectionary passage, but the gospel reading is from Mark, and it deals with Jesus' controversy with the Pharisees and then the Herodians as well. Those who were the Herodians being more committed to the Roman establishment as Jews, and Pharisees more to a legal interpretation of Jewish law over against the government. And nonetheless, they both reacted to Jesus' words about the Sabbath being meant for humankind,
Right.
not humankind for the Sabbath. And then Jesus also heals the withered arm of the man on the Sabbath. And Jesus seems to be making this very kind of point, and that is to say that the point of law here is the protection and preservation and extension of life rather than just the keeping of the law. And it seems to me that this is a way of us wrestling as Christians with the question of whether we are obeying the law of the land or obeying the law of love, which is our command from the Lord.
Yeah, and you know, law, national sovereignty, borders, these are all helpful things. But when they become things that prevent the basic act of charity toward the weakest, toward the vulnerable, well then, as far as I read the Gospels, Jesus would be clear, you know, and so for a Christian to quarantine the radical ethics of Jesus and say, well, for the good of the state, so on and so forth, we can't do what Jesus would obviously tell us we should do, right? And that's, I think, the sort of repeated ethical dilemma Christians in public life find themselves facing.
As I read the comments, letters to the editor following your column about this, it did strike me that there is this tendency in the pew among lay people to say, yes, but. So, yes, Father, I understand your point and that we should love our neighbor as ourselves, as Jesus told us, but, and then the but, and of course I always say, whenever you say yes, but, the only thing that people really hear is what comes after the but, you know. There is a reversion to language of the nation state. Immediately, all the justifications for why we can't do what Jesus said is based upon what ends up being a primary commitment we have to the nation versus our Christian faith. And this is something that you and I both are fans of Stanley Hauerwas, and Hauerwas made this comment. Tell everybody what he said.
Well, he said the biggest problem facing Christians in America today is that they're more Americans than they are Christians. And so, you know, I mean, that is a fundamental problem. I call them the yes but goggles, right?
Okay.
We you know, Jesus said, forgive, love your enemies, so on and so forth. Give to the person who asks for you to give them something. And we hear all these wonderfully radical, challenging things, but we put our yes but goggles on, which completely diffuses it. And I get that, and it's a tempting thing for me to do when I read the Gospels. But here's the thing: at no point does Jesus tell us, "Hey, here are these yes but goggles. Go ahead and put them on." He never ever says that. And so, as preachers of the gospel, as you and I are, it's our job to stand up in a world and say, Jesus didn't let us off the hook here.
Yes, right.
He did not let us off the hook.
Right.
And all your excuses, all your referencing to, the sovereignty of the nation and stuff like that, I get that, and nations are good things, but not at the expense of mother and child.
Yes.
Right. And so that's the gospel, as far as I see it, plain and simple.
The good news that transcends all borders, that transcends all ideologies, all nation states. And yet Jesus, because he didn't offer a yes but goggles for himself or others, he ends up being crucified.
Right.
And yet I, as a preacher, much prefer to be respected.
Oh, indeed,
much
yes.
prefer to be adored and admired,
Yeah.
and have people say about me, thank God someone articulated my prejudices for me in a way that actually fit my gospel, right?
Welcome to modern Christianity.
Yes.
It reminds me of a line by St. Augustine, and it haunts me, but I remember it. Augustine said once in one of his sermons, he said, I'm afraid of being afraid. I'm afraid of being afraid. And I think that's something we preachers should say to ourselves every day, because I think that's true. It's much easier to preach a nice little homily, go sit down, get a nice pat on the back or an email, and do absolutely nothing for the kingdom,
right.
or for your people. It's much easier to do that. But our boss was crucified, and we ought not forget that.
Let's pick that up after the break. Thank you.
Cristo Rey Dallas provides a Catholic college preparatory education to students of all faiths who live at or below the federal poverty level. Students work in 140 of Dallas' premier businesses one day each week to earn 65% of the cost of their educations. 100% of Cristo Rey Dallas students will be admitted to college, and 97% will be the first in their families to attend college. The students will be prepared to serve and to lead in college and in life. To find out more, visit CristoRayDallas.org.
Josh, we are living in a new age of technology, and the church is trying to figure out how to use it. And one of the things that you and I are both doing are these podcasts.
Right.
So this is called Good God, but you also have a podcast called Words. And what's the subtitle of that one?
The Priest and the Pragmatist.
The Priest and the Pragmatist. And this is a conversation that you engage in with one particular person, Ralph Strangis, who is the former voice of the Dallas Stars hockey team. And he is just a tremendously interesting person, not a person of faith, but a person with lots of curiosity.
Certainly, yeah. Ralph's open, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And he and I are just friends. He reached out to me after one of my columns in the Morning News, and we went and had a hamburger for lunch, and we kept on having lunch and at different hamburger spots around Dallas. And our conversations would get deeper than you would think, and we decided to put it in a podcast, and it just went from there. And we hope to get back in the recording studio some point soon. But it's really just our friendship and our conversation. Ralph grew up Catholic, so he speaks the language. He calls himself an agnostic, but I have my conversations like this with him to I'd love to bring him back into the church, but that's only going to come by way of friendship and dialogue, because he's a beautiful soul, and I'm not one to beat people over the head.
Well, it is good news. It's supposed to be something that draws us to God. It's not something we browbeat people into, right? But this actually is, I think, a demonstration through this conversation of what good Christian and church witness is, and even the word evangelism, which is so fraught with a history of abuse and the like. Say a little bit about your understanding of evangelism and how God works in these conversations.
Right. I mean, for me, I became a Christian because I saw Christ and His gospel as beautiful. And the beauty of God, captured me and enraptured me. And so I see evangelism really in terms of the presentation of beauty, right? A coherent preaching, a coherent theology, so on and so forth, as best one can present it, that is in lockstep with a beautiful performance of life, right? Human flourishing, happiness, the virtues, true charity, and so I see it as a performance of beauty which should bear witness and inspire, and I take all that to talk about Ralph. I take all that and that's how I understand our friendship, and it should play itself out as a true and open and vulnerable conversation with the other who is different. And Ralph has his views and his experiences. I have my views and my experiences. And we're both real with one another, right? I don't have a script for him. I don't have step 1, step 2, step 3 to try and get him into the church. I have nothing other than my affection for him, and he's the same. And so part of our game with the podcast is to show others, especially in this politicized world, and that's what this beautiful project is about as well, is to show the world that, hey, people who are different can sit down and talk. And it's not a Facebook post, it's not a tweet, it's not a position even. It's friendship, it's conversation, it's dialogue, it's being honest with one another, willing to push buttons, knowing you can do so because the love is there, right? And so it may one shock Ralph. I love Ralph, right? And because I love Ralph, it works. And I think that's a good model for evangelism in 2018.
So I think most people, when they think of evangelism, assume that we have, as Christians, all the answers, and we have arrived at a position, finally, where we simply have an urge and a desire to get other people to share our position, and for them to see the light, and there's nothing coming back. But you're talking about this in terms of your own authenticity, vulnerability, about how you are being converted and changed in certain ways through this conversation with someone who does not share all of your faith position. I think most people would be surprised and maybe delighted to learn that evangelism really is a two-way street, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A few things. I was very influenced by Iris Murdoch. And if you read the very beginning of her Gifford lectures, she describes the moral training of children. And she says, training a child to be moral is like walking that child through a garden, stopping at a beautiful flower and saying, look, isn't that pretty? Isn't that pretty? And that's how I see my witness, my evangelism. I look at Jesus, and I've fallen in love, and I just want to say, that's beautiful.
Right.
That's really beautiful.
Right.
And I'm in the middle of an experience, in the middle of a love affair with Jesus, that is bigger than me. It's a mystery. It's not a bunch of data that I've mastered.
Right. Right.
And so I just want to go to someone like Ralph, go to someone in a Starbucks and say, this is really beautiful. Give it a look, And so it's not about having all the answers. I mean, you and I know how foolish that is, to think of Christianity in those terms.
It reminds me of Aquinas' experience, as a matter of fact.
Right.
I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas, who had wrote the Summa Theologica, and who had attempted to gather all of the thoughts and truths of reality into his works. Nonetheless, late in life had this experience, right? An experience of beauty that transcended all of the answers,
right.
all of that sense. And so it's not a kind of know-nothingism that we're talking about here. It's actually that you know enough to realize that there's you're probing a mystery that is deeper than doctrine, that is an experience of love and beauty that is more profound than anything we can learn even or say.
Right. I put it in terms of the married life, right? And so I preached on this just the other day. I am a happily married man. I have joys in my life because of my wife, because of my family, that I didn't know even existed. I couldn't even known to ask for those joys until I fell in love with one beautiful young woman. And it's from that particular love with Allie in Lubbock, Texas, that I was ushered into the happiness which sustains me now.
Yes.
And that is analogous to what happened to me when I fell in love with Jesus. And so it's not transcending the particular, which is Christ, but it is going into a mystery that is, I mean, it's endless.
Yes.
I mean, you quoted Thomas. I mean, Gregory of Nyssa is a wonderful sort of mystical treatise on the life of Moses. He said, we know that we're in the presence of God when we have ceaseless desire, right? I mean, it's about stepping into an infinite, which just doesn't stop, and it's truly keeps me going,
And I think most people, again, probably would find that to be a very odd statement from the church and from a pastor, that it's about ceaseless desire when so many people think of Christianity as the control of desire.
Right.
But it's really about the direction of desire,
Absolutely.
isn't it? It reminds me of, in Dante's Inferno, where when he finally gets to Paradiso and is finally there's this sense of where his heart's desire all along has been following love and this beauty that Beatrice is, his love for her. He finds out it's really a love for God.
Right.
It's through his love for her that he discovers this love for God, and it's the turning of desire finally ultimately to God and realizing where it all comes from.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the whole commedia. I put it in earthy terms as well, in the sense that I really do love Cheetos, but if I stick with Cheetos, it's not going to go well for me. So I need to control my desire for Cheetos if I want to survive, and if I want to sort of stay the beautiful, fit person that I am.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And so yeah, I mean, there is the control of the reformation of desire, really,
right.
that leads to a happier flourishing. Anybody who goes to the gym to exercise knows exactly what we're talking about.
Right. Tell us how your relationship with Ralph has changed you. What do his questions and his challenges, how has that shaped or moved or changed your understanding of yourself and your faith?
Ralph's been a gift on that score because, I mean, you probably experienced this as well. Sometimes we religious leaders can get stuck in our bubble. We can get comfortable with our scripts. We can refuse to put ourselves in those places where we're challenged.
Yes.
Relationally, rhetorically. It's comfortable for me to just stay in my social circles where everybody says, "Yes, Father," and I love those people. I love those experiences. But with Ralph, he gives me what people are thinking. He gives me what he's thinking. He is not going to respond to the script the way other folks respond to the script. And so he provokes an authenticity, to use that word, which as a preacher is like gold. Right?
Yes, right. Well, we every Sunday we stand up and we try to offer people a way to live in the world, and it helps us, I think, in these kinds of conversations to know what people in the world are thinking. That we're not only presenting our insider view of things, but we have a kind of Anthony Thistleton talked about the two horizons, that there's the horizon of the world and the horizon of the church, and that there's a kind of a bridging of those horizons, a kind of walking back and forth across the bridge. And having those conversations is really important to us and our spiritual health and our vocational success, isn't it?
Well, right, and also because plainly God is there. I mean, God is in Ralph Strangis. God is in, the person who doesn't want to have anything to do with you. And so as preachers, we have to look for God there too.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, it's a joy to be in Dallas with you and to
Likewise.
be colleagues and now to get to know one another
Right.
even better. Thank you for the work you do, not only in your parish, but for the sake of the church and the world, through your writing and your calling all of us to be more faithful in every aspect of life.
I say the same to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay,
Thanks.
great. Good to see you, Josh.
Cristo Rey Dallas provides a Catholic college preparatory education to students of all faiths who live at or below the federal poverty level. Students work in 140 of Dallas' premier businesses one day each week to earn 65% of the cost of their educations. 100% of Cristo Rey Dallas students will be admitted to college, and 97% will be the first in their families to attend college. The students will be prepared to serve and to lead in college and in life. To find out more, visit CristoRayDallas.org.